I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 61, After the Battle, 1. After systematically eliminating 5 splinter forces of the coalition army, Luo Wen's forces had exterminated approximately 120,000 to 130,000 red and black ants. Although Luo Wen's swarm lost around 10,000 troops, reinforcements arriving gradually from the mobile units more than compensated for the losses, increasing the swarm's numbers by over 20,000. The coalition army finally sensed something amiss and hurriedly regrouped their forces, merging their troops into a single large contingent. However, even in the span of just half a day, the reunited army seemed visibly smaller when viewed from above. Luo Wen no longer felt any sense of crisis. His initial caution toward the red ants had stemmed from a lack of understanding of their capabilities. Now that they had laid all their cards on the table, dealing with an opponent as slow and limited in reconnaissance capabilities as them was simply too easy. As the red-black ant coalition continued marching, they gradually realized they had entered a trap. Any scouting parties sent out would mysteriously vanish as soon as they strayed a short distance from the main army. Along their route, they encountered an overwhelming number of confusing pheromone markers, making it impossible to determine the proper direction to proceed. Too cautious to split their forces again, they could only trudge forward blindly. Day turned to night, and an entire day passed quickly. To their dismay, the coalition army discovered they had come across their own tracks from the previous day. Indeed, they had spent the entire day wandering in circles under Luo Wen's deliberate guidance. Every time they dispatched scouts, the scout bugs in Luo Wen's swarm would spot them. Ambush teams riding transport bugs would then lie in wait ahead and swiftly eliminate the enemy. Subsequently, the spy bugs accompanying the ambush teams would erase all traces of the engagement and replace the enemy's pheromone markers with fake ones. The coalition had no way of distinguishing between genuine and fake signals, forcing them to blindly follow along. Over the course of this day, the coalition lost over 10,000 scouts. The losses continued to pile up, and by the next day, another 10,000 scouts were gone, with the coalition army still trapped in its feudal loops. Days of marching without resupply were taking a toll. Exhausted and demoralized, the coalition army made camp to conserve energy and sent out small groups to forage for food. However, these groups, averaging about 10,000 each, were like throwing dumplings to the wolves. None returned. By the end of the day, out of more than 10 foraging teams, only 2 returned, bringing back little food. With another 100,000 troops lost, the coalition had no recourse. Stranded without supplies and blinded by their sealed-off surroundings, they could only send out more foraging parties the next day. Luo Wen's forces had swelled to nearly 300,000 after days of consolidation, giving him ample manpower to set up more intricate traps. As a result, not a single foraging team returned to the coalition army that day. At night, the effects of prolonged hunger finally erupted. While ants lacked the concept of morale, hunger caused noticeable unrest. The red ants began attacking the black ants, killing and eating them. Strangely, the black ants, despite being more numerous, offered no resistance. Suffering from the same starvation, they silently watched their kin be slaughtered, their antennae drooping as they passively awaited their fate. Luo Wen observed this unfolding chaos with interest. Given a few more days of siege, the coalition might just annihilate itself. Still, the monotony of round-the-clock command for several days was beginning to bore Luo Wen. Facing an opponent of such low intelligence offered no sense of strategic satisfaction. The coalition's remaining 200,000 troops were utterly exhausted and had lost much of their combat strength. It was time to finish them off. Messengers scurried about, rallying Luo Wen's forces. His 300,000 strong swarm surrounded the coalition completely and began to close in. Despite their lack of rest, the swarm had access to ample food, all of it nutrient-rich muscle tissue, leaving them far stronger than their starving adversaries. Additionally, Luo Wen had intentionally conserved the worker ants' acid reserves, allowing their depleted glands to refill. The coalition's first greeting came in the form of a saturated acid bombardment by nearly 200,000 worker ants. This initial assault alone wiped out 50,000 to 60,000 combatants, leaving the battlefield terrain muddy with acid. In some areas, pools of acid had even formed. The swarm troops, equipped with acid-resistant armor, ignored these obstacles entirely. However, the same terrain posed immense challenges for the coalition. Many ants found their legs corroded and snapped, causing them to collapse. Once their bodies made contact with the acidic ground, they soon became irretrievable casualties. Even under such adverse conditions, the coalition's desperate counterattack inflicted significant losses on the swarm forces. Most of the casualties were among the frontline soldier ants and transport bugs, while the worker ants in the rear sustained minimal losses. This was by design. For this war, Luo Wen's swarm had mass-produced large numbers of soldier ants and transport bugs. Soldier ants served no productive purpose and were only needed for combat, while transport bugs, though vital for moving troops and resources during wartime, were carnivorous and unsustainable in peacetime due to their high meat consumption. With the final battle underway, and the coalition's main force fully engaged, Luo Wen prioritized conserving the worker ants, which were far more valuable for post-war reclamation and construction efforts. The battle raged until dusk. Afterward, the worker ants hauled away intact corpses from both sides while collecting severed and corroded body parts to be processed for protein recovery. This 7-day campaign annihilated over 700,000 coalition troops at the cost of 90,000 swarm forces. The final battle alone accounted for half of these losses. Luo Wen stood before the queen ant of the red ants, its limbs severed and presented by his worker ants. This was his prize of war. He hoped it might yield some valuable genetic fragments, though his expectations were low. As a species similar to the black ants, Luo Wen doubted the red ant queen would possess any unique traits. Cleaning up the battlefield would take considerable time, but Luo Wen saw no need to linger. Days of sleepless command had pushed him to his mental limit. It was time to rest. Chapter 62, After the Battle, 2. As expected, keeping his expectations low proved wise. The next morning, Luo Wen awoke to find no new gains from the Red Ant Queen. To be sure, he would need to return to the brood nest to verify the specifics. But before that, there were still post-battle tasks to handle. After a day's rest, Luo Wen led his 300,000 strong swarm across the border into the Red Ants' territory. Following the climactic battle, the coalition forces had been annihilated, and no remnants had been spotted along the way. Luo Wen had assumed that taking over their territory would be a mere formality. Unexpectedly, not long after entering enemy territory, his forces encountered 2 fully assembled units numbering over 30,000 ants in total. These troops had likely been on a distant hunting expedition and had only just returned, intending to reinforce the front lines. Unluckily for them, they ran straight into Luo Wen's swarm as they neared the border. There was little to discuss. With transport bugs dividing the battlefield and 300,000 troops surrounding the enemy, exterminating the 30,000 strong force was a matter of minutes. The red ants may have accepted the black ants as prisoners, but Luo Wen had no interest in doing the same. These basic model combat units, equipped with only a rudimentary friend or foe recognition system, were riddled with vulnerabilities. Recycling them into protein was their best use. That said, the red and black ants of the coalition were surprisingly steadfast, showing no inclination to surrender. Before long, they became part of the swarm's food reserves, loaded onto the backs of transport bugs. Over the next few days, Luo Wen deployed scout bugs to survey the area while leading his forces along the border to conduct sweeps and ambushes. The coalition had considerable reserves, with units frequently arriving from afar. Their numbers ranged from a few thousand to tens of thousands, though none exceeded 30,000. Each time one of these units appeared, either Luo Wen or the scout bugs would spot them, and the swarm, with numbers several times greater, would surround and eliminate them. After intense skirmishes, these units would obediently become food reserves. Within just a few days, Luo Wen's forces had wiped out over 30 groups, amounting to nearly 500,000 enemies. However, since these units typically appeared individually, with an average size of around 10,000, their collective resistance inflicted fewer than 10,000 casualties on the swarm. Luo Wen couldn't help but reflect that if the coalition had better supply chains and the patience to wait a few more days to amass a million-strong army, the situation might have been more challenging. Several more days passed, and Luo Wen had not encountered any more coalition reinforcements heading for the front. It seemed their distant hunting parties had all returned, making further waiting unnecessary. Thus, the swarm finally advanced deeper into coalition territory. Encountering no resistance along the way, it became clear that after their home nest had been flooded, the queens had moved to the front lines. No troops had been left to garrison their territory, as all available forces had been sent to support the front line. Unfortunately, the ants' primitive communication methods meant they remained oblivious to the war's outcome and had continued sending reinforcements to their doom for days. At this moment, Luo Wen felt an urgent need for advanced communication methods. Regrettably, he still had no idea how to obtain such technology. The swarm advanced 500 meters northward, arriving at the volcano-shaped nest entrance that had once served as the Red-Black Ant Coalition's home base. It remained flooded and held no strategic value. Luo Wen did not linger, instead sweeping the area to eliminate potential threats. His forces zigzagged another 500 meters north, consuming a significant portion of their food reserves along the way. Finally, Luo Wen confirmed the area within a kilometer radius to be temporarily secure. He then divided his army into two groups. The first group, comprising soldier ants, transport bugs, and a small number of worker ants, totaled about 70,000 to 80,000. They were tasked with carrying the majority of the food reserves and continuing northward along the current route. These units needed to sustain themselves through constant warfare and would be sent to expand the swarm's territory. Luo Wen led the remaining 200,000 worker ants back toward the border. Along the way, he split them into 50 groups, leaving one group at intervals to construct new bases. By the time he returned to the border, Luo Wen was alone. However, he soon encountered another swarm unit escorting 50 queen ants. These queens had been stationed near the front lines, and Luo Wen had sent messengers to summon them once the newly occupied territory was deemed secure. The 50 bases constructed along the route were meant for these queens, who would oversee and develop the surrounding areas. Of course, 50 queens would not suffice to cover a kilometer-wide territory. Luo Wen planned to hatch additional queens upon returning to the brood nest. These new queens would fill the gaps in the current bases and could also be dispatched to garrison the northern territories captured by the expeditionary force. With these arrangements in place, the territorial dispute was finally resolved. Luo Wen returned to the brood nest to resume his reclusive lifestyle. Through the brood nest, Luo Wen confirmed that the Red Ant Queen had provided no new genetic fragments, a result he had anticipated. However, the question of why the Black Ants had submitted to the Red Ants after their queen's death remained unsolved. It was likely a mystery that would persist indefinitely. Fortunately, Luo Wen felt no curiosity or desire to acquire such an ability. Trusting the Black Ants was out of the question, so turning them into nutrients to power the queen's egg-laying was undoubtedly the better option. Life returned to tranquility, and the swarm continued its steady development. During this time, Luo Wen re-established two expeditionary forces for strategic exploration. The first was the reformation of the Western Army, which had been recalled during the initial phase of the war due to severe manpower shortages. With the war over, they resumed their westward exploration. The second was a newly formed Northwest Army, tasked with exploring the blind spot between the territories covered by the Western Army and the Northern Army. As the exploration distances of these two forces increased, the gap between them would inevitably grow, necessitating a dedicated force for this region. Both expeditionary forces were instructed to send back small teams to report every 3 days. To address their limited intelligence, Luo Wen assigned each force a queen ant to accompany them. Queens, with their comparatively higher intelligence, could at least relay simple messages. As the territory expanded, Luo Wen could no longer personally survey the land for updates. To maintain balance, Luo Wen also dispatched a queen ant via transport bug to join the Northern Army. The ants' lack of selfishness ensured they would readily accept this parachuted commander with enthusiasm. Chapter 63, The Enemy Reappears, 1. To the south of the brood nest lay towering cliffs, while lakes and rivers hemmed in the east. Even so, with the west and north connected in a fan-shaped expanse, the swarm's territory expanded rapidly as the three armies pushed forward. Day by day, Luo Wen continued dispatching hundreds of queen ants to oversee and develop the new territories. The swarm scale was steadily growing, yet it remained far from capable of directly confronting the Yellow Earth Ant Legion head-on. The days stretched on in monotony. Without internet, phones, games, or newspapers, and not even a creature to converse with, loneliness loomed over Luo Wen. Gradually, the reports from the three armies, delivered every 3 days, became the highlight of his otherwise dull existence, the sole reprieve in his barren life. Unfortunately, while the queen ants possessed some intelligence, it was only relative to the simple-minded worker ants and soldier ants. Their reports were terse, devoid of richness or intrigue, and failed to bring Luo Wen any satisfaction. As boredom gnawed at him, Luo Wen began to fear that without some kind of diversion, he might succumb to depression. Sometimes, he found himself staring at the distant lake surface from a tree trunk, even contemplating trying to swim to see if he could evolve the ability to breathe underwater. Luckily, reason still held sway over his impulses, narrowly restraining these self-destructive thoughts. But as his restlessness grew, his rational grip began to erode. Just as Luo Wen felt he might succumb to his reckless whims, a message from the Northern Army brought good news. they had encountered red ants once again. The black ants, though diligent, were disorganized and weak. They posed no threat and served only to replenish the expeditionary force's food stores when discovered. For this reason, the destruction of countless black ant nests by the three armies was considered trivial and unworthy of reporting. The red ants, however, were different. As a nomadic species capable of enslaving black ants in numbers several times their own, they were highly threatening. To prevent mishaps, Luo Wen had specifically instructed the queen ants to notify him immediately upon spotting red ants, retreat 500 meters, and establish camp while awaiting his arrival. The queen ants faithfully executed his orders. Given how far the northern army had advanced, this newly discovered red ant colony was undoubtedly unrelated to the remnants of the earlier one. It signified a new red ant nest. Luo Wen had been yearning for something to shift his focus and pull him back from the brink of despair. However, the red ant's lifestyle and population density meant each nest required a vast area to sustain itself. This explained why it had taken the northern army so long to find another nest. Thankfully, though delayed, the opportunity had finally come. Luo Wen wasted no time, setting off immediately. On the journey, Luo Wen's thoughts turned to the yellow earth ants, whose behavior resembled that of the red ants. Both were nomadic predators. If a red ant colony of merely hundreds of thousands needed such expansive territory, how vast must the yellow earth ants' domain be to sustain themselves? Perhaps they didn't simply scour the area every few hundred days but instead maintained a constant state of predation, moving along a predetermined route that took hundreds of days to bring them back to the cliffside region. Luo Wen shuddered at the thought. If this were true, how many troops would he need to amass to exact revenge? Lost in thought, Luo Wen's 8 long legs carried him forward in a sprint. At over 60 centimeters in body length, his raised legs made him more than a meter tall, dwarfing ordinary worker ants, which now seemed like mere specks before him. Yet this growth came with limitations. His newly evolved oxygen supply system had reached its maximum capacity. Any further growth would render it unable to sustain his body. Once again, Luo Wen faced a bottleneck, urgently needing new genetic fragments for reference. The riverside environment, dominated by ant species, offered little in the way of diversity. He could only pin his hopes on the other two armies deeper inland to uncover something new. After traveling approximately 3 kilometers, Luo Wen passed a swarm base, the furthest outpost to date. Beyond this point, he was stepping outside the swarm's controlled territory. Initially, Luo Wen thought the northern army would be just ahead, but even after advancing another 2 kilometers, he still couldn't locate them. At first, he suspected he might have gone the wrong way. Yet the faint pheromone markers along the route confirmed otherwise. Then, he wondered if the northern army had already been wiped out. But there were no signs of a battlefield or a recent skirmish. The forest here was exceptionally lush, and it seemed to have rained recently. Water droplets occasionally fell from the leaves above, striking Luo Wen's carapace with a refreshing chill. The ground was muddy, with puddles forming in some areas impassable barriers for ordinary worker ants, but easily traversable for Luo Wen with his current size. The pheromone markers along the path had also been diluted by the rain, with some completely washed away by puddles. Fortunately, Luo Wen's elongated antennae, enhanced by his growth, allowed him to maintain his bearings despite the challenges. Still, he slowed his pace. Venturing so far beyond the swarm's territory without finding the northern army was troubling, and caution was warranted. Although he doubted anyone would set a trap specifically for him, he tensed his muscles, prepared to flee at a moment's notice. Advancing cautiously, Luo Wen covered another 2 kilometers. Night was falling, and a light drizzle began to descend from the sky. While faint pheromone markers still lingered in the air, their identity verification signals appeared genuine. However, Luo Wen himself was adept at altering such markers. He had once used this technique to confound the Red-Black Ant coalition, leading them in endless circles. There was no guarantee someone or something wouldn't attempt the same trick against him now. Moreover, he was nearly 4 kilometers beyond swarm territory. Typically, a queen ant would be deployed as soon as the army advanced, to claim the land, provide logistical support, and facilitate communication. Would they really send a few messenger ants to crawl several kilometers back to swarm territory alone? The messenger ants, being ordinary worker ants, lacked his resilience. The dangers along the way were far too numerous for them to survive. As Luo Wen pondered these concerns, convinced he had stumbled into a trap, reality delivered a sharp slap to his assumptions. Chapter 64, The Enemy Reappears, 2. As it turned out, Luo Wen had overthought the situation. Just as he became increasingly convinced this was a trap and was about to turn back, he found the Northern Army. A whirlwind of emotions swirled within him, though his limited vocabulary left him unable to articulate them properly. Maybe it's because I've been too idle lately, letting my thoughts run wild and making me overly jumpy. Despite scaring himself along the way, it was a relief that the situation had been a false alarm. Finding the Northern Army was undoubtedly good news. Rain was still falling from the sky, and the army had taken shelter inside a tree hollow. Their small size proved advantageous. They could easily crawl into the hollow to avoid the rain. Luo Wen, on the other hand, had to settle for a patch of relatively dry ground beneath the tree canopy. Even under the cover of leaves, rain still dripped onto his carapace. Watching the snugly sheltered insects only stoked his irritation. These troops must have made swift progress. How else could their messenger ants report back every 3 days? It seemed even the queen ant's intelligence was not entirely reliable. Reflecting further, Luo Wen questioned his own laziness. Perhaps he should occasionally catch up with the armies to check on their progress. Given his long legs, covering this distance was no issue. The swarm's advance was not a rapid march. They meticulously cleared the areas along their route, eliminating all dangers to pave the way for the queen ants arriving later. This slow pace explained why Luo Wen, after surpassing the last swarm base, had become increasingly suspicious of a trap after traveling less than 2 kilometers and was on the verge of turning back after 4 kilometers. In hindsight, he realized the fault lay with him. He had not kept track of the army's progress and failed to deploy queen ants promptly. It was, yet again, a communication issue. The messenger ants sent back by the Northern Army only ever reported all clear. Luo Wen had not anticipated that the follow-up base deployments had fallen significantly behind. Once more, Luo Wen felt an urgent need for a long-range communication system. After reuniting with the Northern Army, he conducted a headcount. Despite starting with 70,000 to 80,000 troops, they still numbered nearly 70,000 after such a long time, a testament to the power of an all-soldier ant force. While the army took refuge from the rain, Luo Wen decided to scout ahead alone. With his newfound focus on reconnaissance rather than idling on tree trunks, his vision had evolved significantly. He could now see clearly for over 200 meters. Unlike human sight, he could distinguish individual ants over 100 meters away, although his vision gradually blurred until objects beyond 200 meters became opaque. His long legs, elevating him over a meter high, provided a natural 8-legged tripod, granting him an excellent vantage point. Combined with his agility, Luo Wen realized he was the swarm's top scout. Luo Wen advanced cautiously, and after scouting about 300 meters, he spotted the Northern Army about 200 meters away. True to his orders, they had retreated over 500 meters from the Red Ant's nest, whose iconic volcanic structure was visible in the distance. Perhaps due to the rain, no patrols were in sight around the volcano. The Red Ants had likely retreated inside their nest to stay dry, lacking Luo Wen's size advantage. Suddenly, mischief sparked within Luo Wen. He sprinted to the volcano, and before the red and black ants inside could react, he used his burrower ant-like legs to collapse part of the structure. Then, he pushed soil into the volcano's mouth, sealing it shut. Satisfied, Luo Wen fled the scene, feeling a childlike joy. This act reminded him of a favorite pastime from his early days, poking ant nests with sticks and blocking their entrances. Though he lacked the finishing touch of boyhood antics, his prank brought him some delight. However, as he reflected, a faint melancholy clouded his mood. The rain's incessant patter only deepened the bittersweet feeling. Without tear glands, Luo Wen found himself unable to vent his frustration. Returning to the shelter, he was surrounded by thousands of living beings, yet not one could share in his emotions. With a sigh, he lay under the tree canopy, his body blending seamlessly with the environment. The rain persisted through the night but finally ceased by late morning. While occasional drops still fell from the leaves, the conditions were now suitable for movement. The Red Ant's nest, based on the size of its volcano, housed at least 1 million ants. The 60,000 troops under Luo Wen's command would be charging to their deaths if they attacked it. Though Luo Wen longed for a battle to distract him from his reckless tendencies, he wasn't suicidal. Moreover, being so far from his territory posed logistical challenges. Reinforcements and supplies would be delayed, and even if they captured the area, there weren't enough troops to hold and develop it. Having caused some trouble for the Red Ants, Luo Wen consoled himself that the trip wasn't entirely in vain. With that thought, he led the army back to their territory. Upon returning, he ordered the 60,000 strong Northern Army to camp near the border and secure the surrounding region. He then rushed back to the brood nest. Connecting with the brood nest, Luo Wen postponed other tasks and dedicated himself to producing 500 queen ants. The region between the swarm's territory and the red ant's nest spanned about 4 kilometers, an area even larger than the swarm's existing territory. A significant number of queen ants would be needed to secure and develop it. Furthermore, both the initial troop surge for attacking the red ant's nest and the subsequent occupation of their territory would require a large number of queen ants. Thus, Luo Wen decided to go all in, ordering 500 queen ants, a staggering number considering the swarm currently had only around 300. After setting things in motion, Luo Wen rested for a night and spent the next few days inspecting the other two armies. The Western and Northern armies faced similar challenges, with large blind spots between their positions and the swarm's territory. The Northwestern Army was slightly better off due to its fan-shaped exploration zone, which kept its position relatively closer to the territory. Nonetheless, the blind spot in their area was just as vast as those of the other two armies. If the other two armies' blind spots resembled vertical rectangles, the Northwestern armies resembled a horizontal one. In any case, the 500 queen ants would not be enough to cover these gaps. Realizing this, Luo Wen hurried back to the brood nest overnight and ordered an additional 700 queen ants. When fully matured, the swarm would boast approximately 1,500 queen ants. The brood nest would be occupied with this task for quite some time, leaving no room for other projects. Chapter 65, The Attack Begins, 1. In the following dozens of days, Luo Wen moved ceaselessly, meticulously planning the locations of new branch bases along the outskirts of his territory. He also commanded all the queen ants within the territory to focus entirely on producing worker ants. After this period, the first queen ants to mature had already emerged from their pupae and steadily moved to their assigned locations. Due to the sheer number of queen ants hatched this time, even with over 300 already working at full capacity, the brood nest being the largest production base was fully booked and unable to assist further. The worker ants produced by these queens alone were insufficient, especially as many of the queens still had significant labor shortages within their territories. As a result, the standard allocation of bodyguard troops, initially increased to 2,000, was reduced back to 1,000 per queen before deployment. Luo Wen had little choice in the matter. After all, the territory had already been cleared, and any insects that could pose a threat to the bases had long been converted into military rations. These areas were safe enough, so the queens were sent to gradually develop their regions. Once production capacity improved, he planned to make up for the deficit. After another few dozen days, the brood nest completed its orders and shifted its focus entirely to producing worker ants and transport bugs. With its production capacity gradually freed up, a steady stream of worker ants was delivered to various bases via transport bugs, bolstering their labor force. The brood nest, continuously sharing Luo Wen's genetic code, had grown slightly larger than Luo Wen himself and had necessitated several expansions of its underground chamber. Its production capability, proportional to its size, was equivalent to that of 200 queen ants. With new queen ants gradually taking their places in the northern base, the territory's borderlines advanced steadily. Time flew by, and within 100 days, the original buffer zone of roughly 4 kilometers was occupied by the swarm. Numerous bases were scattered like nails across the area, connecting into a unified network. As the border drew closer to the red ants' hive, patrol squads from the swarm inevitably encountered foraging teams from the red ants' colony. Red ants were nomadic predators, inherently living off plunder. While Luo Wen's side had developed a form of animal husbandry, establishing and expanding pastures required significant land resources. Therefore, neither side backed down when they met. Without a pre-battle exchange of insults, both forces verified each other's pheromones to confirm they were not allies before clashing violently. Luo Wen had anticipated this encounter. Relying on just the few hundred troops in a swarm patrol squad, they wouldn't have stood a chance against a foraging team of over 10,000 red ants. Thanks to his superior vision and mobility, Luo Wen had already mobilized 60,000 northern troops stationed nearby to set up an ambush in advance. Using a pocket formation, he awaited the arrival of the unsuspecting foraging team. The battle was one-sided. A mixed force of over 10,000 worker ants and soldier ants was no match for 60,000 elite soldier ants. The result was as expected. The Northern Army completely annihilated the foraging team, suffering only minor losses of just over 100 soldier ants. After this, battles became frequent. Foraging teams near the border repeatedly stumbled into ambushes laid by the Northern Army. Luo Wen's forces, with their numerical and strategic superiority, thoroughly routed the red ants in every encounter. After each battle, they cleared the battlefield and masked the pheromones, preventing the red ants from realizing anything was amiss. By the time the red ants had lost over 30 foraging teams, their forces in this direction were nearly depleted. However, setting traps in other directions to gradually weaken them would be too troublesome. In the past, Luo Wen had been patient in dealing with a red ant hive due to his limited strength. But now, he and his swarm had grown far beyond their former selves. With 1,500 queen ants at his disposal, the swarm's potential for war was unparalleled. Following his command, aside from the roughly 300 queens stationed too far from the northern front line, the remaining 1,200 plus queens and the brood nest ramped up production. Under such circumstances, the front line amassed a massive army of 1 million worker ants and 100,000 soldier ants in a short period. Combined with the 60,000 soldier ants already stationed there and additional auxiliary troops, a force of nearly 1.2 million was assembled. In sheer numbers alone, they already surpassed the red ants' hive. A direct assault was no longer an issue. At this level of strength, there was no need for tactics or a slow war of attrition. Standing before the densely packed swarm, Luo Wen felt a surge of pride. His demeanor began to mirror the arrogance he once despised. The advance of the million-strong army was overwhelming. Though the insects were small in size, their numbers blotted out the sky. For anyone with trypophobia, this scene would be utterly horrifying. Every insect encountered along the way was devoured as rations for the army. Even agile grasshoppers couldn't escape the transport bugs, let alone creatures like black beetles, which once impressed Luo Wen as war gods. Against this massive army, they didn't even register as a threat. Even the red ant foraging teams, once formidable opponents, barely caused a ripple before the swarm. This is what swarm warfare is supposed to look like, Luo Wen remarked, watching his unstoppable army sweep forward. Alas, there was no one to appreciate his bravado. From a distance, Luo Wen saw the crater they had rebuilt. He immediately ordered the army to accelerate and surround the area. The red ants, suddenly besieged by a million-strong force, were visibly stunned and retreated defensively to the crater. Shortly after, several small squads emerged from the entrance. Luo Wen ordered his army to clear a path and let these teams pass. He already knew their purpose. Pheromonal communication had its drawbacks. The information they carried was essentially public once decrypted. These squads were heading out to seek reinforcements. Luo Wen welcomed this. If they could summon all the foraging teams, it would save him the trouble of hunting them down later. As the red and black ants within the hive huddled defensively, Luo Wen refrained from sending troops into the complex tunnels. The confined space would hinder his forces, and he remembered how he had previously used a shut the door and beat the dog tactic to decimate enemy troops. With this precedent, he wouldn't risk a frontal charge. After some thought, he bypassed the perimeter and personally advanced. Using his forelimbs, Luo Wen skillfully collapsed the crater entrance, burying the tunnel in dirt. This was his second time employing this tactic, and he had become quite adept at it. By sealing the entrance, he forced the ants inside to come out. Although their ventilation system made it difficult to suffocate them, difficult didn't mean impossible. The reinforcements had already been sent out. With nothing urgent to handle, Luo Wen decided to surround the hive and ambush any returning troops. Chapter 66, The attack continues. In truth, waiting for reinforcements to return to the hive would take a significant amount of time. Given the current state of the hive, it simply couldn't hold out that long. As expected, it wasn't long before activity was seen on the collapsed mound of earth. The soil began to bulge and shift as sand was gradually pushed aside. Soon, the cautious head of a red ant peeked out. Unfortunately for it, before it could gather any useful information, a spear-like limb pierced through its body, skewering it as it emerged from the soil. One of the transport bugs surrounding the collapsed entrance had acted swiftly. The bug flicked its leg, discarding the red ant's lifeless body. Beneath the transport bug's feet crawled a swarm of soldier ants. The one closest to where the red ant had fallen stepped forward and ended its suffering. More red and black ants began to emerge from the dirt covering the buried entrance. The surrounding transport bugs treated it like a game of whack-a-mole, skewering each ant as it appeared. However, this method of attack was physically exhausting. Under Luo Wen's direction, the transport bugs adjusted their tactics. Instead of impaling the ants, they began using the sticky hairs on their claws to grab the emerging red ants and toss them aside, where soldier ants promptly turned them into rations for the swarm. This reduced energy expenditure significantly, but the number of red and black ants appearing only increased. Fortunately, there were plenty of transport bugs queued up for their turn at Whack-A-Mole and Claw Crane. Exhausted bugs simply relinquished their positions to fresh replacements. Time slipped by, and after 4 or 5 hours, the red ants managed to dig another exit not far away. However, this new exit was still within the swarm's encirclement. This time, with plenty of worker ants on hand, Luo Wen did not hold back the acid. A torrent of corrosive liquid rained down on the new entrance, a deluge of acid. A large group of ants attempting to break through the encirclement barely emerged before being doused in acid. The luckier ones, with only their antennae corroded and minor pitting on their armor, barely managed to escape. The less fortunate were immediately incapacitated, left to helplessly dissolve in the acid. As time passed, the new entrance became clogged with a strange liquid composed of dissolved ants and other detritus. Severed limbs and fragmented bodies floated on the surface, releasing an acrid stench. No further ants attempted to emerge from the opening. Gradually, the liquid dried into a grotesque tableau, exuding an aura of despair and agony. Luo Wen assigned 5,000 burrower ants to bury the hole with more soil, then stationed additional transport bugs and soldier ants to guard it. The horrific sight of the acid-soaked environment seemed to have left an impression on the red ants. They abandoned this exit entirely, and no more emerged. 2 days passed. During this time, 2 foraging teams returned to the hive, providing the swarm with a small boost in provisions. The ants inside the hive had initially made several breakout attempts, but each was swiftly crushed. They had since been quiet for a considerable period. Reflecting on his strategy, Luo Wen realized suffocating the ants in the hive was unrealistic. Even if he filled in their exits quickly, the brief periods of ventilation from digging would suffice to sustain them for quite some time. In hindsight, he thought, perhaps he shouldn't have been so heavy-handed in blocking their exits earlier. This had only scared them into complete inactivity. If they tried digging again, he resolved to let them come out. Unfortunately, another day passed without any movement from the hive. Growing impatient, Luo Wen focused his sensory hairs, probing for the positions of underground chambers and tunnels. He located a spot close to the surface, then used his massive digging limbs to pierce the ground. Repeating the motion several times, he unearthed a large pit, with round tunnels now visible on either side of the walls. Inadvertently, he had dug too far, severing one of the hive's passageways. Ants moving through the tunnel sensed the fresh airflow and rushed over to investigate. Finding an unexpected exit and no long-legged creatures guarding it, a few black ants cautiously emerged, scouting the area. Detecting no danger, they quickly turned back. Moments later, swarms of red and black ants began pouring out of the tunnel. But their celebration was premature. The swarm's encirclement had only moved back slightly. Having been confined underground for so long, the ants streamed out in droves. Within moments, nearly 100,000 red and black ants had emerged from the hive. The prey had left its den, and the swarm's encirclement tightened swiftly. Hundreds of transport bugs led the charge into battle, accompanied by soldier ants. They quickly cleared the area around the tunnel entrance, sealing it off once more. This unit bore a heavy burden. They had to block ants still emerging from the tunnel while simultaneously fending off enemies attempting to retreat back into the hive, effectively fighting on 2 fronts. Fortunately, they didn't need to hold the line for long. After a single round of acid spraying, the enemy's combat effectiveness plummeted, and the swarm's army swiftly eradicated them. It seemed some ants near the entrance reported back, as the tunnel quickly fell silent, and no more ants emerged. No matter. After cleaning up the battlefield and replenishing their rations, Luo Wen simply dug another hole nearby. The ants weren't immune to repeating tactics. Each time the swarm surrounded, eradicated the enemy, cleared the battlefield, and dug a new hole. After several rounds of this, 6 large pits now marred the ground. Though the effectiveness of each successive attempt diminished, over 300,000 enemy troops had been converted into rations for the swarm. Finally, the enemy realized it was a trap. Only a few ants emerged from the last pit. But Luo Wen was already prepared with a new plan. He deployed over 100 spy bugs, dividing them into 6 groups and sending them into the hive through the 6 pits. Their mission: infiltrate the hive and act as guides. Ideally, Luo Wen would handle this task himself, but his large size made infiltration impossible. The spy bug's intellect and adaptability weren't on par with his, but they would suffice. Besides, infiltration into the red ant hive was inherently dangerous. Friendly fire was a real threat, but with enough spy bugs, losses were acceptable. The spy bugs seemed to understand Luo Wen's intent. Once inside, they crawled deeper into the hive, disseminating new pheromone messages as they went. As a result, the tunnels, previously filled with messages like danger, turn back, and path blocked, now also carried contradictory signals such as safe route and exit here. These conflicting messages left the ants confused, unsure of the situation. Some believed the warnings and avoided the entrances, while others trusted the safe signals and ventured out. Soon, red and black ants began cautiously emerging from the pits one by one. Chapter 67, The attack concludes. The enemy troops within the hive were gradually lured out in waves, eventually numbering tens of thousands. 2 hours later, while the occasional ant still emerged from the tunnels, Luo Wen decided it was no longer worth his time. With a single command, giant fang soldier ants led the charge, supported by small soldier ants, with worker ants providing ranged firepower. The massive army split into several units and surged into the hive's tunnels. After enduring several rounds of assaults, the hive's remaining defenders were few. Disoriented by the spy bugs' misinformation, they offered feeble resistance. In contrast, Luo Wen's forces advanced like a knife through butter. With well-coordinated troop formations, the swarm crushed all opposition, even in the tight, winding tunnels. 2 hours later, the hive was conquered. It would now be repurposed into a swarm base, with one of the accompanying queen ants stationed to oversee and develop it. By the end of this campaign, over 700,000 enemy ants had been eradicated, at the cost of just over 10,000 of the swarm's troops. Most of these casualties occurred during the final tunnel battles. The small-bodied red ants excelled at using their stingers in the confined spaces, often achieving a 1-to-1 kill ratio. This resulted in notable losses for the swarm. However, for Luo Wen, who commanded 1,500 queen ants, such losses were negligible. After the battlefield was cleared, relatively intact ant corpses were collected and buried to prevent decomposition. The remains were processed into protein to sustain the swarm's troops. After a day of rest, the army split into several groups. 2 moved in different directions to hunt down the remaining enemy forces in the region, while a third stayed behind to deal with any foraging teams that evaded the sweeps. Over the next few days, these groups eliminated over 30 foraging teams, amounting to around 400,000 ants. This secured Luo Wen's control over the entire area. Following this, 300 queen ants that had accompanied the army with 2,000 bodyguards, 3,000 worker ants each, and ample provisions departed to establish and develop their own territories. The remaining 900,000 worker ants were transported to other regions by transport bugs. Of the 1,200 queen ants previously focused on production, 900 had settled into their designated territories. After a brief rest, they resumed mass-producing soldiers to support the front lines. With the war concluded, it was time to bolster their labor forces. Around 150,000 soldier ants were redistributed. Of these, 50,000 were assigned to reinforce the Central Army, formerly the Northwestern Forces, as the expanding wedge-shaped area under their control required extensive exploration, leaving them severely understaffed. The remaining 100,000 soldier ants, along with a small number of worker ants, scout bugs, and transport bugs amounting to a force of 120,000 were reorganized into the Northern Army, which continued advancing along the riverbank. As for Luo Wen, he had his own plans. He needed to rendezvous with the Western Army, which had reported a vaguely described anomaly requiring his personal attention. With the battles here concluded, Luo Wen welcomed the distraction. Staying idle only tempted him to seek unnecessary risks. As the largest individual in the swarm, Luo Wen's size made it impossible to travel leisurely aboard a transport bug like the others. Instead, he relied on his long, powerful legs for locomotion. Fortunately, his size also granted him exceptional speed faster than the transport bugs, and his 8 strong legs allowed him to leap over obstacles such as small ravines or exposed tree roots with ease. Setting out in the morning, Luo Wen maintained such a rapid pace that, despite stopping to inspect the development of several branch bases along the way, he reached the Western Army by nightfall. After resting overnight, Luo Wen set out early the next morning with the Western Army to investigate the anomaly. The anomaly had been encountered during the army's advance. The Queen Ant overseeing the troops had ordered them to bypass the area and sent a team to notify Luo Wen. Thus, Luo Wen's route led him backtracking slightly. Traveling about a kilometer southeast from the army's position, he reached the marked area. It lay close to a cliff face, where numerous large boulders had tumbled down from the heights. The rocks were piled together, forming massive gaps between them. From the outside, the area appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary pile of rocks. Although it covered a significant area, no obvious abnormalities were visible. This was where cannon fodder came into play. Luo Wen flicked his antennae, signaling 2 transport bugs to step forward. They dashed toward the pile of rocks at incredible speed. Like Luo Wen, their adhesive claw hairs allowed them to traverse the smooth rock surfaces with ease. Their strong leg muscles provided impressive speed and agility, allowing them to leap and twist through the rock gaps effortlessly. It seemed they were enjoying the rare opportunity to sprint unburdened, displaying an almost playful excitement. But Luo Wen soon noticed something unusual. The frolicking transport bugs had disturbed the area's hidden inhabitants. From the shadows of the rock crevices, several creatures began to emerge. Their bodies, though slightly slender, were still powerfully built. Their heads, thoraxes, and abdomens were connected in a segmented but uniform manner, lacking the distinct separations characteristic of ants. Their heads bore 8 eyes, a slightly larger central pair and 3 smaller lateral eyes on each side. Their faces were flat, with no antennae. On either side of their heads extended massive pincers, each shaped like a pair of menacing claws. Behind the pincers, large muscle groups emphasized their formidable strength, making them appear exceptionally dangerous. 4 pairs of walking legs extended from their bodies, which were low to the ground. Despite their size, these creatures could easily pass through narrow gaps, unlike the similarly sized transport bugs. Their bodies were covered in thick, jet-black chitinous armor, providing exceptional defense. The exoskeleton was densely coated with hairs, particularly on the pincers, which were more rugged and heavily furred than the rest of their bodies. Most notably, a long, slender tail extended from the rear of each creature, curling over their bodies. At the tip of the tail gleamed a sharp, barbed hook that glistened ominously. Luo Wen stared in shock. If it weren't still daylight, he might have thought he was back on Blue Star. The creatures bore a striking resemblance to scorpions, so much so that even now, they seemed to confirm that scorpions existed here as well. Chapter 68, The Scorpions. So this is the so-called anomaly. Luo Wen mused to himself. Well, in a way, it was indeed something unusual and precisely the sort of anomaly Luo Wen needed. His genetic library hadn't seen new additions for quite some time. As soon as the scorpions emerged, Luo Wen's eyes lit up at the sight of their massive pincers. His burrower limbs had become somewhat redundant and only functioned as blunt tools for smashing. If he could integrate those powerful-looking claws, his Luo-style combat techniques might gain a few new moves. The sharp, menacing scorpion tails, likely venomous as per usual scorpion behavior, caught Luo Wen's attention less. It wasn't out of vanity he had long given up caring about his appearance. Luo Wen had embraced his monstrous form, a patchwork of insect parts cobbled together into a bizarre fusion. After all, nobody was around to judge what this amalgamation looked like. The problem lay elsewhere. Chitinous exoskeletons had become standard equipment, making the scorpion's stinger impractical. Besides, Luo Wen rarely engaged in direct combat himself these days, and he already had venomous fangs inherited from a spider. A similar weapon would only be redundant. Still, these considerations were pointless. Luo Wen had no control over his evolution. For all he knew, he might wake up one day to find a hooked tail sprouting from his rear. As Luo Wen pondered these thoughts, the lead scorpion seemed almost offended by his disregard for its tail. When another transport bug leapt past it, the largest scorpion struck like lightning, clamping one of the bug's hind legs with its pincer. The momentum of the transport bug's jump nearly lifted the scorpion off the ground. However, its low center of gravity proved advantageous. Though its body was dragged upward, its clawed feet maintained a firm grip on the stone beneath. Once the transport bug's momentum faltered, the scorpion yanked it back. The two began an impromptu tug-of-war, the transport bug pulling against the scorpion's grip. Despite losing one leg's leverage, the bug's remaining 7 legs still outnumbered the scorpion's 4, giving it a slight edge. But as the scorpion exerted more force, the trapped leg bent unnaturally, threatening to snap, a situation that ironically worked in the transport bug's favor. If the leg broke, it could escape, albeit with the loss of a limb. At that moment, the scorpion surged forward, planting its other pincer beneath the bug's body. Using both claws, it flipped the transport bug onto its back, exposing its vulnerable abdomen. The scorpion's tail, coiled above its head, struck with blinding speed. Its hooked stinger latched onto the bug's underside and slowly sank into its body. Luo Wen observed with interest, finally understanding the tail's true utility. His experience as an insect was still limited, He had assumed the hook would target an opponent's back. He realized now how wrong he was. The evolution of such a tool was far from ornamental. Insects typically had robust back armor that was difficult to penetrate. In contrast, the underbelly, though often protected, was relatively weaker or even soft in some species. The scorpion's hook could easily pierce through these vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the scorpion's low stance gave it exceptional stability in grappling situations. Once it could flip an opponent, the stinger became a decisive weapon. Meanwhile, the transport bug managed to free itself from the scorpion's pincers, but the tail hook remained embedded in its abdomen. The tug-of-war now shifted to the scorpion's tail. Unfortunately, the transport bug was already succumbing to the venom. Its strength waned rapidly, and it ultimately lost the contest. As the bug stopped struggling, the victorious scorpion raised its pincers like a triumphant general, flaunting its might. It then moved beside the transport bug to enjoy its hard-earned meal. Luo Wen, having enjoyed the spectacle, decided it was time to end the charade. His antennae flicked, releasing a pheromone signal that sent tens of thousands of swarm troops surging forward. Luo Wen stayed back, confident that new genes would soon be presented to him. Although the scorpion had bested a single transport bug, it now faced hundreds of them. And the transport bugs were merely support units. Atop them rode thousands of specialized soldier ants, their compound eyes fixed menacingly on their prey. While the scorpions towered over the soldier ants, their sheer numbers rendered size differences irrelevant. Leading the charge were the giant mandible soldier ants, the most formidable frontline warriors of the swarm. Refined through countless battles, these units had proven their versatility and strength, surpassing the dwindling numbers of giant fang soldier ants and hook soldier ants. The giant mandibles surrounded the scorpions in a single charge. Familiar tactics like leg pulling and eye gouging were executed with precision. Though their mandibles couldn't easily pierce the scorpion's thick back armor, their tails and legs were far less protected. The scorpions fought back ferociously, each pincer grasping a giant mandible soldier ant, while their tails sought targets. But the ants were no pushovers. Their serrated mandibles bit into the scorpion's tail, penetrating the armor and embedding themselves. The long tail offered multiple vulnerable points, and 7 or 8 ants attacked simultaneously. The scorpion's legs suffered a similar fate. In mere moments, the scorpion was dismembered, its legs and tail severed and scattered around its body. Thick bodily fluids oozed from its wounds as it lay incapacitated, unable to move or attack. Yet, even in this state, the scorpion hissed defiantly, baring its fangs at the diminutive ants. Its defiance, however, sounded more like a feeble whimper. The battle ended so quickly that the other scorpions hadn't even reacted. Before they could intervene, they were also dismembered and reduced to writhing lumps. The hissing chorus grew annoyingly loud. Luo Wen flicked his antennae again. Several small soldier ants, modeled after red ants, approached and drove their stingers into the scorpion's wounds. Venom wasn't exclusive to scorpions. The hissing gradually ceased. The scorpion's sturdy exoskeletons made them difficult to consume directly, but they could still be processed into a beverage. Chapter 69, New Claws. The specifics of the feeding process need not be described in detail. After feasting, Luo Wen found a large crevice in a nearby rock and lay down to rest. Meanwhile, he ordered the army to camp around him. Since it was still early morning, and the battle had ended too quickly, Luo Wen found it difficult to enter a dormant state. Instead, he began reflecting on the recent skirmish. The scorpions, despite their formidable individual combat prowess, seemed capable of standing against tens of thousands. However, in reality, only about 100 giant mandible soldier ants had done the heavy lifting. The rest of the swarm was mostly there to spectate, much like Luo Wen, who had merely watched the spectacle. This performance underscored the terror of collective combat once more. Unless an individual reached another level of evolution, it was impossible to negate the advantage of overwhelming numbers. This realization further solidified Luo Wen's resolve to pursue the path of the swarm. In his dreams, Luo Wen felt as if his hands were melting. Startled, he almost awoke, only to remember that he no longer had hands. A pair of burrowing legs and 4 pairs of walking legs, losing one pair wouldn't matter since he could always regenerate severed limbs. Reassured by this thought, he sank back into sleep. He had no idea how long he slept, but when he awoke, it was still dark. 2 moons hung high in the sky, casting a cold, silvery light. Luo Wen sensed something unusual about his burrowing legs. Looking down, he saw a layer of dead skin peeling off them, as if they were shedding. Upon closer inspection, he realized that this layer of dead skin was the exoskeleton of his original burrowing legs. So, this was molting. Previously, whenever his body absorbed certain genes and underwent significant changes, it would cocoon and mutate. However, this was the first time he had experienced localized molting. It seemed his earlier anticipation of growing chelae was coming to fruition. As for a scorpion's tail, it was likely not happening. If he were to develop a tail, he would most likely need to cocoon. He glanced back and felt around. His guess was correct, there was no new tail at his rear. Next, it was time to test his newly obtained claws. Tearing at the molting skin on his chelae with bites, Luo Wen exposed the still soft and sticky inner limbs. Once freed, the chelae rapidly swelled to double their original size. They then began hardening and darkening. Before long, the chelae were fully armored again, but now the armor was thicker. The internal musculature was also much stronger. With a thought, the two massive pincers opened, revealing a row of sharp serrations that glinted coldly. He flexed the chelae. Despite their appearance being bulkier than his previous burrowing legs, they remained remarkably agile. In particular, the joints seemed to feature a specialized mechanism resembling a spring-loaded trigger, enhancing his striking speed. A flicker of black light flashed. The pincers accurately clamped onto a nearby rock. With a squeeze of his muscles, there was a sharp crack, and the rock shattered into pieces. Awesome! Luo Wen couldn't help but exclaim inwardly. This was exactly what he had been hoping for. Like a child with a new toy, Luo Wen went on a destructive spree, pulverizing everything around him. Rocks, plants, and even scorpion exoskeletons all fell victim to his havoc. Luo Wen was ecstatic. Not only had he gained a powerful new weapon, but these chelae also gave him a sensation akin to having hands again. Granted, each hand only had 2 fingers. Still, this newfound familiarity almost brought him to tears. After his excitement subsided, Luo Wen calmed himself. There was no use dwelling on the past, he needed to focus on moving forward. Overall, while only his chelae had been enhanced this time, the improvement to Luo Wen's strength was immense, not just in combat, but in daily life as well. He also discovered that when the pincers were closed, the chelae could still function as burrowing legs. Moreover, their increased size made digging even more efficient. This left Luo Wen a bit speechless. With the matter resolved, the Western Army continued their journey. Luo Wen returned to his lair and resumed his monotonous daily routine. Each day consisted of little more than eating and lounging on tree trunks to enjoy the scenery. Time passed, with the only notable events being the constant departure of queen ants and Luo Wen's steadily improving eyesight. However, his immense size limited the number of trees in his territory that could support him, restricting his vantage points. This greatly diminished his scenic enjoyment. The tedium of life reignited Luo Wen's reckless curiosity. Although he had eliminated 2 red ant nests during this period, the growing strength of his swarm had rendered such conquests dull and meaningless. There was no sense of accomplishment, and it did nothing to suppress his urge to seek danger. With no better options, Luo Wen tried to find tasks to distract himself. First, he inspected his territory. With its continued expansion, the swarm had added another 1,000 queen ants, bringing their total to over 2,500. Thanks to flourishing agriculture, abundant food, and a lack of major conflicts, the colonies experienced explosive population growth. Each base now housed at least 5,000 members, meaning the swarm's total numbers had soared to at least 12 million. Though most of these were worker ants, the swarm's war potential remained formidable. With their current resources, they could easily raise an army of 1 million at short notice. For instance, during the recent assaults on the 2 red ant nests, Luo Wen had summoned 1 million troops in no time. He no longer bothered with tactics like attrition or ambushes. These strategies were redundant. Instead, he simply ordered his forces to bore holes into the enemy nests and flood them with troops. Although this resulted in higher casualties, it didn't matter. Once the nests were captured, the fallen insects were recycled into protein. Within days, the queen ants would transform this protein back into soldiers for the battlefield. In the past, Luo Wen had felt a surge of excitement commanding his swarm in their first attack on a black ant nest. Eventually, black ant nests became mere supply points for the army. Now, encountering a black ant nest required neither reporting to Luo Wen nor his direct involvement. The swarm simply bulldozed through. As a result, Luo Wen no longer knew how many black ant nests had been destroyed. It seemed red ant nests were destined for a similar fate. Could this be the loneliness of the master? Luo Wen found himself tempted to hum a tune about the solitude of invincibility. But then he remembered the looming threat of the Yellow Earth Ant Legion and lost all enthusiasm. As an insect, it was best not to grow too arrogant. Out of options, Luo Wen turned his attention to the lakes and rivers in the east. There was little choice. The north and west were being explored by the swarm's armies. The south consisted of cliffs and deserts patrolled by the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. Only the east remained undeveloped. Previously, Luo Wen's smaller size had made even the shallow areas of the riverbanks perilous. Fear of the unknown depths had kept him away. His closest encounter with the riverside had been during the first attack on a red ant nest. Even then, he stayed half a meter away from the river, avoiding the breach of barriers for water channels. Now, with his long legs, Luo Wen felt he was ready to challenge the riverbanks. Chapter 70, An Unfamiliar Force. Slivers of sunlight reflected off the lake's surface, creating a shimmering display. Along the lake shore, slender stems and leaves of aquatic plants swayed gently in the breeze. Luo Wen moved cautiously on his long legs, staying 2 to 3 meters from the water's edge. His large compound eyes were fixed intently on the lake, scanning for any signs of suspicious activity. The reflected sunlight on the lake was glaringly bright. With Luo Wen's compound eyes being particularly sensitive to light, the intense glare caused a persistent throbbing and stinging sensation. For several days, Luo Wen kept watch without any success. Just as he was beginning to feel both dejected and impatient, an unexpected development occurred. The prolonged exposure to the reflective glare seemed to have triggered an unexpected adaptation in his eyes. His vision began to develop the ability to filter out certain light wavelengths. With this newfound ability, his eyes functioned like wearing sunglasses. The sunlight reflected off the water's surface became far less blinding, allowing Luo Wen to observe more comfortably. Revitalized by his new ability, Luo Wen resumed his slow exploration along the lake shore with renewed enthusiasm. As he walked, he transitioned from the lake to a river. Though the river was less than 10 meters wide, its rapid current and unknown depth made it seem like an insurmountable barrier to Luo Wen. If he could figure out a way to cross the river, the vast lands on the opposite shore could become new territory for the swarm. Unfortunately, with his current knowledge, Luo Wen had no immediate solution for crossing the river. For now, he could only hope to encounter some aquatic species that would grant him new genes. With such an enhancement, crossing the river or even exploring the depths of the lake and river would become possible. Days turned into weeks, yet Luo Wen found no evidence of life in the river. Lacking other tasks, he patiently continued his investigations. As the saying goes, persistence pays off. One evening, just as Luo Wen was preparing to return to eat and rest, he noticed ripples spreading across the river's surface in the distance. A wave of excitement surged through him. Ripples couldn't appear without something interacting with the water. This indicated that some entity had come into contact with the surface. Though Luo Wen could clearly see the source of the ripples, he was unable to discern what lay beneath the water. The cause of the disturbance remained a mystery. He kept watching for a while, but the river's surface returned to stillness, making him wonder if he had imagined it. Could it have been caused by underwater plant roots? The flow of the river brushing against aquatic vegetation could create ripples, but such occurrences were typically confined to areas near the banks. The location of the ripples, however, was at the center of the river. No aquatic plants could possibly grow there. Even as night fully descended, Luo Wen remained vigilant. He refused to believe his eyes had played tricks on him. Though he hadn't identified the culprit, he had at least confirmed the presence of aquatic life, which was a significant discovery. This realization reignited Luo Wen's determination. The next morning, as he prepared to resume his observation with renewed vigor, a team of messenger bugs arrived with news from the front lines. This time, the Northern Army had encountered an unusual situation. Searching for aquatic life could wait. Investigating the swarm's anomaly took higher priority. Fortunately, Luo Wen had been exploring near the riverbank, not far from the Northern Army's location. Though he slowed his pace to accommodate the messengers, he still reached the army's position within 2 hours. The morning was still young. Led by a reconnaissance team, Luo Wen caught sight of a familiar crater in the distance. He assumed it was yet another routine mission to exterminate a red ant nest. But as he approached, Luo Wen noticed something unusual. Streams of ants were pouring continuously out of the crater, forming multiple unbroken lines as they marched hurriedly away. Have I been discovered? But the direction doesn't match, Luo Wen initially suspected he'd been spotted. However, despite his imposing size, Luo Wen had honed his stealth skills to perfection. He had altered his pheromones and coloration, rendering himself indistinguishable from a large boulder to the ants. As he observed the army's trajectory heading away from his position, Luo Wen realized he was mistaken. But their urgency intrigued him. What could they be rushing toward? Curiosity got the better of him. Luo Wen dismissed the reconnaissance team, instructing them to return and order the army to camp in place and remain still. Meanwhile, he used his superior vision to maintain a safe distance from the marching red ants, trailing them discreetly to uncover their destination. The red ant army marched north for about 300 meters. Soon, Luo Wen spotted a large-scale battle unfolding ahead. Tens of thousands of combatants from both sides were engaged, scattered across more than a dozen skirmish zones. On one side were the familiar red ants. Their adversaries, however, were an entirely new ant species. These ants' coloration was somewhere between the bright hue of red ants and the jet black of black ants. Their bodies were a subdued dark red. The worker ants of this species were slender, with their heads, thoraxes, and abdomens of similar size. Their thin, elongated legs gave them a highly agile appearance. Their soldier ants, however, were strikingly unique. Their abdomens remained unchanged, but their heads and jaws were greatly enlarged. The soldiers' massive rectangular heads featured a wide central groove running from the rear edge to the forehead, giving them the comical appearance of a human backside. Their bulbous heads and jaws combined resembled overripe cherries. Despite their amusing appearance, these massive jaws radiated power, suggesting formidable offensive capabilities. What fascinated Luo Wen most was the significant variation in body size among this species. Unlike the uniform sizes of red ants or black ants, this new species displayed dramatic differences. For example, their workers ranged from a few millimeters to over 5 centimeters. Among the soldier ants, the smallest were 3 to 4 centimeters long, smaller than the largest workers, while the largest soldiers approached 20 centimeters in length, veritable giants of the ant world. To put this in perspective, the transport bugs of Luo Wen's swarm, which carried hundreds of ants over long distances, were only about 30 centimeters in size. Even Luo Wen himself, having reached the limits of his respiratory system, was only slightly over 60 centimeters long. These gigantic soldier ants posed a tangible threat to him. Feeding such enormous creatures would require staggering amounts of resources. Even transport bugs, sustained during wartime by abundant protein, numbered only in the hundreds. After battles, they consumed the bulk of spoils, drastically reducing their numbers during peacetime. In Luo Wen's branch bases of 5,000 members, maintaining just 5 transport bugs strained resources to their limits. When idle, these bugs even resorted to eating dirt to ease the burden on the colony. Yet here, on the largest battlefield, there were over 20 of these massive soldier ants. Smaller giants numbered in the hundreds, and the ranks of large, medium, and small soldiers were uncountable. Additionally, other battlefields nearby hosted similarly scaled conflicts, with over 100 giant soldier ants in total. Luo Wen clicked his mandibles in disbelief. Supporting such a vast army of soldier ants was beyond the capability of any ordinary colony. Moreover, the forces on display likely weren't even the entirety of this unfamiliar species army. Maintaining such a formidable force would require an extraordinarily vast territory.